The early days of the iPhone and the App Store and all of the indie dev movement that happened in the mid to late 2000s is a huge inspiration for me and why I got into programming. A lot of these apps weren't only inspirations for me, but for inspirations for apps that we still use today. Big advancements like pull to refresh and, mobile games all started in the early and mid to late 2000s and on these devices of these iPhones and iPod touches. This is also when the tools for software development has become a lot more democratized. The level that you needed to kind of release a piece of software was much lower than in the past, thanks to things like the App Store and digital distribution through websites, which made this kind of particular era of iPhone development and software so unique compared to almost any other era of computing history. While all these changes were very beneficial at the time, when you look at the particular part of computing history and kind of mobile computing at the very least, that was most impactful for myself and the technology world that we live in today, there are some unique challenges to preserving this part of history. So let's get into the challenges of preserving this era versus other eras of computing. In the 80s to 90s era of software distribution, everything was pretty much sent to customers via physical releases in big box software. This, of course, included operating systems that were released in big boxes and even smaller apps and games that were released in CD jewel cases in the 90s. Even pre-CD era software was released in more preservation-friendly media, such as tapes or even magazine listings of program code. This made preservation of software from this era relatively easy due to the medium and wide availability of the software. On the other hand, most of the software in games in the mid-2000s and upwards had no physical releases, especially for mobile games. Most of the software was released on the internet, because at that point the internet was fast enough that most people's home download speeds were able to download big apps and software without much of a hurdle as it was in the 90s. Online checks for ownership and licensing also flourished during this era, meaning that if those services are no longer active to confirm you have a valid license, you may not be able to properly use that piece of software anymore. However, most ARM up until the mid-2000s was something that was mostly taken care of via sharing serial numbers or simply cracking the old piece of software, causing preservation to be much more accessible. More modern DRM, such as FairPlay, which is used in all mobile apps from Apple and the App Store, is much more complex and challenging to circumvent. Coupled with the challenges that most mobile software wasn't released via any other distribution than the App Store, which linked purchases and downloads to accounts, the DRM linked to the software is even trickier to crack, causing preservation to be even more difficult. When looking at all the hardware from the 60s and 90s era of computing, a lot of that hardware was released was built off of mostly off-the-shelf components. There were some pieces of custom hardware in those devices, such as chips and other kind of connectors, but advancements in solutions like this FPGA device from Analog allows for reverse engineering and helps managing the preservation of this hardware a lot easier. In addition, most of the hardware from this era was also not sealed and glued together, meaning repairing and upgrading hardware is much more accessible. Things like early Macintoshes, which had various issues with the power supplies over time as the capacitors leaked, those are all very easy to repair at this point. Capacitors are readily available, and at the end of the day, with a little bit of soldering skills, you can repair most problems of most of these old devices between the 60s and 90s. In contrast, mid-2000s hardware was a time of unique exploration and experimentation. This led to a lot of the hardware, though, being sealed through adhesives. This sealing in makes repairs much more difficult. Take, for instance, this first-gen iPad. Trying to replace this screen means tearing up a gasket seal, removing clips that sometimes break during the removal process, and overall possibly damaging the overall body of the device. Leaky capacitors are a huge issue right now with a lot of old pieces of not only computing, but gaming history. That's why replacing these capacitors with off-the-shelf components that are new really gives a longer life to a lot of these pieces of hardware so that they can be preserved and experienced by a lot more people. On the other hand, mid-2000s hardware all widely used this piece of technology called lithium-ion batteries. While these batteries helped enable a lot of the devices that became so popular, they also have a huge downside. Lithium-ion batteries can cause serious damage if they're not replaced before they start to swell due to age and temperature and various use cases. The swelling can damage the screens and circuit boards by splitting them due to the increased pressure inside of the sealed device, leading to even more complex repairs. In addition, even if you made all the repairs, another challenge would be obtaining lithium-ion batteries of the right specifications and, most importantly, the right connectors. Worse off, if we look at even later 2000s hardware, some companies even started to design their own custom lithium-ion batteries, leading to finding replacements for them to be even more challenging for repairs. There are some efforts for emulation when it comes to iPhone hardware. Projects such as Touch HLE, which aims to replicate the early iPhone SDK for easier emulation of games and apps, are a great effort in this arena. However, this emulation isn't quite there yet to help preserve all the various aspects of early iPhone software. Hopefully, with enough time, emulation for iPhones will become as widespread and effective as other emulations for game systems and older pieces of computing history. My goal is to help preserve one of the most important parts of computing history and the experiences I grew up with. I'm calling this Project Cocoa Archive since I want this to be a repository of all the great innovation and experimentation that occurred during the mid to late 2000s. I'm hoping to accomplish this in two main ways. The first is the highest possible resolution capture of the various apps and games from this era. With the help of a capture card in my old iPhone 4S, which supported HDMI video out, I'm going to play and experience much of the old apps I used to use every single day. I'll be uploading this content in two ways. The first being is to this channel with some commentary of my own history with the app and thoughts. And the second being the raw footage I plan to upload to archive.org with no commentary for mostly historical purposes. The second step of this preservation is more of a stretch goal for me. Before WWDC was pre-recorded and at the height of the indie app revolution, Apple used to interview developers about their apps and app development story. I plan to reach out and attempt to interview some of the early pioneers of mobile app development to have them tell their story. I'm happy to finally announce this project that I've been slowly working on over the past year or two. I already have at least one video planned going over one of my early iPhone games that I just absolutely loved, hoping to release later this week, so hopefully you'll check that one out.